Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this latest Green Alliance event, which is going to explore whether, for all the promising words we've heard in the UK and from many other governments, we really can get a green recovery and a just recovery from COVID-19, one that has climate justice at its heart. My name is Shaun Spiers, I'm Director of Green Alliance, and this is one of a number of events we've been holding over the last 2 months looking at the impact of COVID-19 on environmental policy. Green Alliance is working in a number of the policy areas that we'll be discussing this afternoon, working closely with a range of NGOs and businesses. And if you'd like to join our work or find out more about it, please do get in touch after this event. We really couldn't have two better qualified people to discuss this question of how to get a green and just recovery than our guest this afternoon. Mary Robinson is chair of the Elders. Professor Lord Stern is chair of the Grantham Institute at LSE. Both of them have much longer CVs than that, but that's the short version. Now, the three of us are going to have a panel discussion for about 30 minutes and then take questions which you can pose using the Q&A function towards the bottom of your screens. And if you like somebody's proposed question, use the thumbs up icon and it's more likely to be asked. Belinda Gordon, Green Alliance's Strategy Director, will be collating these live questions as well as those that were sent in advance, and we'll try to cover as much ground as possible. And in the background is Ollie Mount, our events coordinator, who should be able to sort out any technical glitches. There is also a chat function, and you're welcome to use the chat to, as it were, chat among yourselves, but we won't be monitoring that. So if you want to ask a question, please do use the Q&A function. Finally, if you'd like to tweet, then please do use the hashtag, which should be under my face, as it were, hashtag GA event, capital G, capital A event. So on with the show, and I'd like to start by asking Nick Stern the obvious question, which is whether we can really get a green recovery this time, one with nature and climate at its heart. As we know, we've heard lots of positive statements from the UK government, from the European Union. There seems to be a real willingness to do things differently this time than after the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. But elsewhere, we've seen the United States ripping up environmental laws. We've seen Brazil crashing the rainforest. We've seen China opening new coal mines. So things are pointing in different directions. And even the big 130 billion euro stimulus package that's just been announced by the German government looks more like a kind of conventional Keynesian stimulus than a specifically green stimulus. So I'd just like to ask, Nick, do you really think we can win it this time?
Yes, I think we can, but we have to make the arguments clearly and strongly that if you compare this time and last time, the technologies we have at our disposal are enormously different. We're now right across the world producing renewable energy much more cheaply than conventional fossil fueled electricity. And the understanding of the issues is much deeper than before. The last 2 or 3 years, we've had global recognition of the importance of going to net zero, why we have to go to net zero in emissions, and how to do it. We've seen in that understanding that there's a real growth story here of a very, very different kind, one that breaks the relationship between the economy on the one hand and damage to the environment on the other by doing things very differently. So that understanding is much bigger. The politics is bigger. More and more countries have signed up to the target of net zero. More and more countries, partly because they've seen how we can do things much better. Now, what a good idea to have cities where you can move and breathe and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, even if you've never heard of climate change. And that has changed, I think, the politics. The young people, and we salute them, have changed the politics. So the politics has changed and the business has changed. Business have realized that if you look at the good performers over these last years, it's those that have committed themselves to responsibility, including and particularly on the environment. Capital value of the fossil fuel firms has gone right down. firm after firm, financial sector, financial institution after financial institution, has realized that these are the technologies, the activities, the ways of doing things of the future, and that to stick to the technologies and activities of the last century and the 19th century is to lead yourself into risk and trouble. So all those things are very different from 10 years ago. And on top of that, and you did mention Keynes, a hero to most economists, and if you look at what we need to do to come out of what is a desperately risky and difficult economic situation around the world, the ways forward from the sustainability agenda are, on the whole, what you need. Fast, you can do it quickly. Labor intensive, employ lots of people, and with strong economic multipliers. So the activities will generate more activities through the expenditures of the people who earn wages. Fast, labor intensive, and with strong multipliers. Think of retrofitting buildings. Think of making cities more friendly to cyclists and pedestrians. Think of rooftop solar. Think of broadband. That's a classic Keynesian digging of holes in many cases. And on the natural capital side, those are physical capital. Natural capital side, think of trees, restoring degraded land, managing water, and so on. Again, fast, labor intensive, and with big multipliers. So the activities of the recovery from the sustainable agenda are enormously attractive, simply from the Keynesian story of how to get demand going and how to get people back to work quickly.
And before I come on to Mary, can I just say, do you really think that is now grasped by the Treasury and the government as a whole? Because clearly it is it's grasped by Keynesians. This hasn't been a notably Keynesian government. Keynesianism has been out of fashion actually for longer than this government.
I don't think it's a question of fashion. I think it's a question of circumstances. We have deep unemployment, and that's precisely where you need to bring the Keynesian insights to the table. The insights I've described in a fully employed economy would have to be different. But this is a case of major unemployment, and that's why these arguments are so important. Yes, they are being discussed. The Royal Economic Society a couple of weeks ago, which I helped organise from the LSE, had a series of webinars on building a strong and sustainable recovery, at which many people from the Government Economic Service and Bank of England were participating. So the discussion is happening, and I hope the ideas are developing.
Great, thank you. So if I can now turn to Mary and ask the sort of analogue question about whether we can get a socially just recovery. And I heard a broadcast you gave the other day where you said you felt more optimistic now than you did at the beginning of the year, in spite of the horrors of COVID-19. And of course, COVID-19 has revived trust in experts, it's revived faith in the power of the state, and so on. But from a justice point of view, it's also hit most heavily Black and Asian minority ethnic communities. It's exacerbated social and economic injustices. Can we do better in terms of the long-term recovery than we've done during the short-term crisis?
I think we can. I do agree with Nick there, but I think we also need, if we want a green, just, inclusive recovery, to understand the layers of injustice of the climate crisis. And I can think of at least 5 layers that I'll just number briefly, but there are probably more. The first is the one that I first encountered when I started working in African countries in 2003, 2004 and on, for a small organization called Realizing Rights. I was struck for the first time by the fact that people were so impacted by climate change, the lack of predictability for farmers, etc. And that's when I made the connection for the first time between human rights and climate change. I didn't do it when I was High Commissioner, but I did it working in African countries. And so that's the first injustice, because they're disproportionately affected, but least responsible for the emissions. The second layer is linked to that. It's the gender dimensions within that. that women have different social roles, they have different power, they have different access to land rights or access to assets or training, and yet they bear the burden in drought of putting food on the table, of going further for water, etc. And the third layer is the one that the children have reminded us of so visibly, the intergenerational injustice. And both Nick and myself used to have a competition as to which of us would mention grandchildren first. I'll now mention grandchildren first, but we were doing that because we wanted to bring out that intergenerational injustice. And the children are doing it so much more forcefully because they're real truth to power. And the fourth injustice is one that I don't think we think about enough, which is the injustice of the pathways to development. That the richer parts of the world, the industrialized world, built our economies on fossil fuel. And now we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuel with just transition. But developing countries, and Nick will remember this, before Paris, in their nationally determined contributions, by and large signed up to going green, having clean energy. But they said, we will need the investment, we will need the training, we will need the skills, we will need to be helped with this. And unfortunately, they haven't been helped enough. And meanwhile, they have found, many developing countries have found oil or gas or even coal. What are they to do? They must bring their people out of poverty. So that's a responsibility we need to face up to more. And the fifth layer is another one touched on by Nick, the injustice to Mother Nature, that we have destroyed so much of our biodiversity. We know from a report in May last year that there's a potential extinction of 1 million species. And so I really like the fact that the EU is talking about not just a Green Deal recovery with just transition, but also a biodiversity focus. And Nick also mentioned both points. So, I think we can learn lessons from COVID, but we maybe can come back to that. But I do think if we understand the layers of injustice and the fact that COVID-19 exacerbates all these injustices, it's not a great leveler. We don't deal with it equally. And it also brings out the intersectionality between poverty, race, gender, being a migrant, being a person with disabilities, being indigenous. And we see the racial dimensions of it, that it's people of color, it's Black people and people of ethnic minorities who are much more likely to suffer in the UK, in the US, and if we had the statistics available, probably also in my own country.
So, Mary, I wonder, I think we all know that's true, and yet we also see that climate action is often seen as a kind of middle-class issue. How can we get over that and actually show this is not a middle-class issue? It's not just all about better off people being able to buy EVs. This is about justice for everyone.
I think COVID-19 can help us there precisely, as I said, because it has exacerbated the inequalities, but it's also shown us a few things that are interesting in thinking about the link between COVID and climate change. First of all, human behavior matters. It's our collective behavior all over the world that is protecting us from this virus, because we have no vaccine. And we're complying with lockdown, even in great difficulties and very different circumstances. We're complying with social distancing, hand washing, etc. That collective behavior may be very important when we come out of this, as to the richer countries having less of a throwaway society, less consumption, which is one of the consumption and production are in the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, science matters. We know now that we have to listen to the health experts, and policy is, very much complying with the health experts. So too, we must listen much more to the climate scientists. And probably, it really is important that government matters. And I would like, and Nick will know why, to point to the fact that women are leading their countries well at the moment and showing, how to deal with this issue. By and large, it's quite notable, from Angela Merkel in Germany to the prime ministers of Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, the president of Taiwan. Tough decisions in compliance with the science, and then bringing their people in a way that expresses empathy. And that's the last point I'd make, the kind of that because we're all suffering, though not equally, we're open to being more compassionate about the other. And I think that will also help us to come out and to do it in a way that links those who are suffering more, because we have now more empathy for that suffering.
Great, thank you. So if I can get back to some of the kind of hard political decisions, I entirely agree that there is a sort of more of a sense of community now rising out of COVID-19, and so that's something we've got to keep. And there's also more of an emphasis on resilience and a sense that we need to work with nature and not against it. That there are some promising things that have come out of this horror, but if I can ask you, Nick, in terms of the economic changes we need to make, you make a very positive case for the green investments being better than dirty investments. How are we going to persuade people they really need to change their lives? How do you bring people in industries, fossil fuel industries, with you? How do you get the kind of people who love Top Gear with you? There is, my colleague Rebecca Willis has talked about the feel-good fallacy, that we always talk about renewable energy and the positive things we can do, but there's much less emphasis on, say, stopping the roads program, stopping some aspects of consumerism, changing people's lives. I mean, do we need to tackle all that, or can we do this in a way that people won't feel the pain and you can bring people with you?
I think bringing people with you is a bit patronizing. I mean, what we want to do as citizens living together is have a discussion about what's possible, have a discussion about what a good society means. Roads on which people cycle, walk, electric scooters, electric bikes, electric cars, why would we be against those particularly? You know, we don't want to turn this into false horse races or artificial spitting competitions. It's, you know, we've got to find choices that we can bring to the table, choices that we can create together. And changing cities usually involves conversations in those cities, it involves leadership. And that's the kind of discussion we should have. But what we all have to do is to bring to the table what's possible. And one of the things that we've seen in COVID is that we've seen that very rapid change is possible. Many people have seen that they can do an awful lot with what's already in their larder. You know, you can actually husband your resources in different kinds of ways. So what we've learned about resource efficiency, what we've learned about rapid change, I think is very important. We've found out probably we don't need to travel quite as much as we thought we needed to travel. These are all lessons that we've learned and which people discuss and conclusions that they draw. And as Mary emphasized, and you've emphasized, Shaun, we've also learned something about our common humanity and our common vulnerability. And I think that is very important too. But if I could, you raised the question of this being a cuddly middle class issue. I don't think that's generally right. I think there's some elements of that. But if you look, and Mary and I experienced this directly in our work with UNFCCC, if you look at the influence the small island states have had on, we wouldn't have got 1.5 degrees as the target without the intervention and the strong organization and effective political organization of the small island states. It's the people who live in and around forests who have been the most effective champions of the fight against deforestation. A lot of the problems of use of fossil fuels, in addition, of course, to the greenhouse gases and global warming, climate change, are associated with air pollution. And it's poor people who suffer most from air pollution. And you know, it's poor people who benefit most from public transport. So I think that to see it narrowly as a middle class story is actually not in accord with the way in which politics have moved, the way in which action has moved. And it's about understanding the choices, both of what happens if we don't act, but also the different ways in which we can act, which are inclusive and just and much more attractive ways to live for everybody, and actually particularly for poor people.
And Mary, I don't know how closely you've been involved with the citizens' assemblies in Ireland, but certainly some of what Nick's just been talking about does come out from citizens' assemblies that have been held in this country. Is there anything you can say about that?
Well, I think I'm quite proud of the fact that Ireland was, I think, the first to try out the Citizen Assembly some years ago. And we asked it to address three very difficult problems. And one of them was that Ireland was not on track for our commitments on climate, because we have an important agricultural sector, let's put it that way. And politicians didn't want to address it. And the Constituent Assembly came out, the Citizens Assembly came out with a very strong report, which the Parliamentary Committee then took on board, and it became a joint, a cross community effort, which was really good. I'd just like to comment, if I may, on the points that you were putting to Nick about it being a middle class issue. I actually sought deliberately to counter that by writing a book on climate justice, hope, resilience, and the fight for a sustainable future. There are 11 stories in the book. 9 of them actually involve women, but there are 2 good men. But they're all people, you know, fighting from the margins to become resilient. And I had to find in the developed world the stories. There were 2 in the United States. One post Hurricane Katrina, a hairdresser whose salon had been destroyed in East Biloxi, and she had to rebuild and become, as she said, an accidental activist, and went around and formed a women's group, etc. The other one is a scientist from Alaska, a native Alaskan scientist who had been watching the erosion of her land and houses slipping into the water and no money to pay for it. In Europe, the story was in northern Sweden. You know, I had to find the actual real life frontline stories where, in fact, on the margins in the developed world, they were very central in developing countries, but it was all about people building that resilience.
And here's the book in its British edition. Climate justice, a man-made problem with a feminist solution.
Yeah. Could I perhaps explain that? A feminist solution. First of all, man-made is generic, but a feminist solution also includes as many men as possible. It is that inclusive solution that sees the intersectionality between poverty, racism, marginalization generally, and works on that.
Nick, you're muted.
Could I just come in here? As an academic social scientist, I'm trying not to be too nerdy here. If you look at the empirical evidence on how things work better when more women are involved, it's really overwhelming. I mean, if you look at repayment of loans in different kinds of societies, women's performance is much better. If you look at corruption, that governments, local or beyond, where you have more women involved, are less corrupt. And as Mary indicated, women seem to pick up the scientists on science challenges and issues more effectively. It is a very striking and important phenomenon, which Mary, of course, has done so much to help people understand.
Nick, could I just come in with a kind of question on this? I mean, when we're in a COVID-19 lockdown, we understand the essential jobs. And interestingly, they are the healthcare, the health jobs, the care work jobs, the cleaning, low-paid jobs, and many of them are women, and of course, paid less. And you know, I think there has to be a real determination to come out of this COVID crisis and climate crisis in a way that's aligned, but also that promotes gender equality. We were supposed to be marking the 25th anniversary of the Great World Conference in Beijing on women. And it's now unfortunately postponed to next year. But I think there's so much need to, because we've got inequality in our system. It's built in, especially since the crash in 2008, the recovery was so blatantly pro-bank and not pro-people.
I think it's also the counterpart, the so-called essential workers. I mean, it's not so-called, they are essential workers, have been working under much greater pressure. But it's also the case, if you look at the other side, that unemployment, that also has been skewed towards women rather than men, particularly because a lot of women are employed in less formal sectors. And that too has been a part of this story, that the employment pressure has been intense around those areas, and the unemployment pressure has hit in uneven ways as well across gender. It's also, and we should remember, that just as the 2008-10 crisis hit a whole cohort of young people about to embark on their working careers, this same thing is happening now. And if you're hit hard in the first few years of your working life, or your attempt at a working life, those scars carry right through. So there are, I guess, all of us on this call are over 30, I'm just assuming, and at least speaking in this discussion. And we have to remember that there are important generational issues at stake here.
Great. Well, I think we're going to get lots of questions on that and on intersectionality. We've got about 41 questions in the chat. Before I ask Belinda to round them up, can I just ask a last question of you, Nick, which is that Professor Dasgupta is doing a report on the impact of biodiversity loss, the economic impact. Biodiversity and nature has, in many debates, been a sort of poor relation to climate. I think that's less the case now. I think everybody recognises we have a sort of twin crisis. The two are related. You can't solve one without the other. But what would be your advice to him in terms of ensuring that his report has as much impact as your report did all those 15 years ago, however long ago it was, your report for Gordon Brown?
Well, I should say Partha is a friend of 50 years, and I think he's already shown great value in the report. And he will, I think, help us understand much more deeply how we are embedded in nature, embedded in the biome, and that economics has gone wrong for many years, well, a couple of centuries, for seeing in the environment, as it were, as a servant of the economy, rather than something in which we all sit and we're enormously dependent on its services, and we have to nurture them and invest in them and respect them. And I think Partha will be very helpful in enhancing and deepening public understanding of that view. The COVID crisis itself, I think, is deepening understanding. I mean, the majority of pathogens are zoonotic. I mean, they come from animals. And what changing climate and changing biodiversity does is to change the whole set of interactions between wild animals, domestic animals, and human animals. And it changes the interactions between wild animals and within them. I mean, one example, which Lucy Shapiro, a great biologist from Stanford, has emphasized, is we now have birds meeting in the Bering Straits from places where they would not have met in the past. And that kind of interaction creates new viruses, some of which will be nasty and some of which will come to us. But if you look at Ebola, HIV/AIDS, SARS, MERS, bird flu, swine flu, all these are zoonotic and have all emerged from changing relationships between human animals, wild animals, and domestic animals. And the loss of biodiversity, the loss of climate, intimately related one with the other, but also intimately related with the probability and severity of pandemics.
But if I can just push back on that a little bit, I think I mean, you know Treasury officials better than I do, but and Treasury ministers, but you made a very clear proposition that it will cost a lot more to sort this problem out if you don't act now. I can see with some of the zoonotic links that there is one might gamble and risk and sort of hope you won't get another sort of COVID-19 for 20 years. Where is the sort of strong economic argument that will make people in the Treasury sit up and take notice? Is that there for biodiversity in the way that it clearly was for climate, because the debate has changed on climate?
I hope so, because I think the argument has moved on and we understand much more how dependent we are on what sometimes we call natural capital. I mean, if you think of our forests and our land, they determine what happens to our water in a very powerful way. And we are deeply dependent, obviously, on water. They shape productivity of the land in a very important way. I mean, if you take, for example, if you take agricultural subsidies around the world, it's around $500 billion a year. You know, in a world GDP of 80, 90 trillion dollars a year, it's a bit. They're big. And what do you get from them? You get soil which is degraded and mined. You get poisoned water, and you get destruction of forests. If you take the same amount of money and spend it on supporting agricultural activities, so you're not taking money away from farmers in any way, you can do it in very different ways. And you know, you can have public money for public goods. And so for the same amount of money, you can produce something which is much better from the point of view of biodiversity, from the point of view of food, from the point of view of climate. So you know, we have to think of better ways of doing things, and it doesn't always cost more money to do it. It just means spending our money in more sensible ways. And I think those kind of ideas are gaining traction. And I think part of this report will help it along the way. But you know, those people in the Treasury are people that have gone through our universities, and people who are not in the Treasury often try and set them up as sort of terrible ogres. And I don't play that game. I mean, they're thoughtful people trying to do a job. They're doing a job at the moment under extraordinary pressure. And it's our task to bring our thoughts and our ideas, perhaps we have sometimes more time to reflect than they do, to bring them to the table and to discuss. But after all, I did the Stern Review from the Treasury. I did the report of the Commission for Africa, which Mary will remember very well. I did that from the Treasury. So I'm sure that the Treasury doesn't always get everything right, that's to put it mildly. But at the same time, I think it's a mistake to set ministries of finance as the ogres and the problem. We have to, as citizens, work to exchange ideas, work to try to offer good ideas and bring good ideas and express them in ways that people can understand. And of course, when we see vested interests, then we have to describe them as exactly that.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to place on record my love and admiration for the Treasury, and we will, I hope, be holding an event on the Dasgupta review. Belinda, what questions have we got?
The most popular ones on the list is about accepting that there's a strong case for investing in green things, renewables, etc. But also, how can we counter the fact that there might be some sort of window dressing investment in green infrastructure, and in the background there's sort of bailouts that are perpetuating business as usual. And I should point out that there's been an additional question from journalist Fiona Harvey, which is based on some figures just published by the Bank of England a few hours ago, which showed that the automotive sector and airlines are getting substantial bailouts. So how do we counter the sort of the green recovery isn't just window dressing, but that money doesn't continue to go towards business as usual?
So Nick, one for you, and I think we propose a net zero test for any economic recovery, but what do you think?
Well, I've already made the argument a few minutes ago that taking activities, projects, programs from the sustainable agenda can create a very powerful recovery, fast, labour intensive, big multipliers. And I think that argument is gaining traction. I think in the rescue phase, and we're still in the rescue phase, I hope we move to the recovery phase, and we're thinking about that right now, of course. But in the rescue phase, protecting employment is very important. And the economy would really spiral downwards even more strongly if we just told people, well, you work in the wrong sector, sorry about that, mate, you know, you're out of it. People who happen to end up in a good sector, they're all right. Destroying employment at this time would be bad for us all. And a big part of the rescue is keeping people in work, keeping the wages coming in. And I have no objection to that as the primary objective of a rescue policy in the rescue phase. We must be watchful, of course, that we do, just as we don't want to be opportunistically green in the rescue phase, we must be pretty watchful for the opportunistically brown in the rescue phase and rolling things back. But we're now moving into the recovery. And there it seems to me that investing in the activities of the future is fundamentally important. The activities, dirty activities of the 20th century or 19th century, those are not secure jobs. If you're focused on employment, as we have to be, then we have to look to the jobs of the future. And that, I think, is more deeply understood now. And I think it's extremely important as we move into the recovery phase to ask the question, as we roll over loans, as we convert loans into equity, are we helping firms to get into the jobs and activities of the future? So I don't like the language conditionality. I say, are we helping as participants now, as the state is, because it's got so much money in those things? Is it helping people move forward? And moving forward means sustainable jobs, and it means that, of course, every firm should have a net zero target.
Mary, you're muted.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, because you're an expert on China, and this is about recovery. China is coming out of this more quickly, but I'm hearing that China is opening coal plants, and that is not a good example, and yet it's a leader on clean energy. So how do you square that?
That is a big argument that's going on in China. I've had, I think, in the last month, 4 or 5 webinars interacting with our Chinese friends around these issues. There's a big argument going on in China between those who are looking to the activities of the future. And President Xi declared for eco-civilization, declared priorities for looking to more sort of high-tech, less resource-intensive, service-oriented activities. And that is a priority in Chinese, has been a priority in Chinese plans for a few years now. And there are those in China who are pressing very strongly to use this moment to accelerate down that road, to invest back in the future. And there are other pressures, a lot of them from vested interests, which say, oh, look, I mean, we've got to get back going again. Let's do what we know, that's the coal fire and so on. And that argument is intense at the moment. And I wouldn't assume that it's been won or lost, but it's very active. And I think sharing ideas with China, discussions with China, rather than name calling or finger wagging, is extremely important in these coming months. The 14th five-year plan is 2021-2025. It is probably the most important climate event that there is, along, of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative. And that, I think, is of fundamental importance. And that discussion is very live. And many of us are doing our best to pitch in on the side of the future rather than the side of the past.
I hope you win.
No, it's not we win. You know, it's where China chooses.
Yeah.
And, you know, our Chinese friends talk to us about Europe and the UK economy, and it's good that they do. And we talk to them about China's economy. We try to share analyses, priorities. And it's extremely important, Mary. You're absolutely right.
Great, thank you. So more from Belinda, but just a little commercial from my colleague Gwen Buck. if those watching the webinar haven't already listened, I can't recommend Mary's podcast, Mothers of Invention, enough. Amazing interviews with women who are fighting climate change, often on the front line of the crisis. So there we are, Mothers of Invention podcast. Nick, you're trying to heckle.
Like this, I'll show you my book.
You do that. Belinda.
So sort of sticking with the global focus, one of the most popular questions has been about Trump, but maybe I'll try and broaden it out a little bit, and I think it'd be interesting to hear Mary's views on how critical the US is at this time, and bearing in mind it has an election in the autumn. And then, you know, from a UK perspective, the links between us sort of forging a new place in the world, new trading relations, and the relationship between that and the green recovery.
Yeah, I think it is very sad, that's the only word I can use, a kind of neutral word, if you like, that there is a lack of leadership at the federal level in the United States at the moment, both for COVID-19 and for the climate crisis, and they are so interlinked. And as we noted when Trump said that the United States would pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which can't happen formally until the 4th of November 2020, there was the wonderful We Are Still In coalition, which is still there and strong and getting stronger between business, cities, philanthropy, communities, etc. And I think that is really important, but it doesn't compensate for the lack of a kind of global leadership which the United States should be and could be part of and was part of in the past leading up to Paris. That certainly is badly missed. But I think, you know, it's good that the Green New Deal is very much part of the democratic approach to the election. And I hear that Republicans, particularly young Republicans, are looking for their Republican Green Deal now. And that should really be encouraged.
Thank you. Belinda, questions?
Yeah, so there's the most popular question at the moment is one asked by Caroline Lucas MP, which is sort of linking greening economic activity with our patterns of consumption and the idea of things like a universal basic income. And there was also a question posed in this area before the event, which was about kind of the emphasis at the moment in terms of green action is put on individuals as consumers, whereas you know, what do the panelists think about the role of us as consumers versus the sort of need for system change? So sorry, that is I've tried to wrap everything up in there, but I think this issue of sort of consumption, it would be particularly interesting to hear views on.
And I know if I can add to that, perhaps about changes the tax regime to change consumption patterns and to drive sort of lower carbon lifestyles, which is a project Green Alliance is working on. Who wants to go first on that?
Can I have a go?
Yeah, Nick.
There's a lot that individuals can do. They obviously can look at their own consumption and what they eat and how they travel, what energy they use. Buying green electricity is available to everybody in the UK. So food, transport, energy are all choices that we can make. Of course, it's very important that we get all the information that we need to make those choices. You can, as an individual, ask about where your pension is invested if you have savings in a pension fund. And again, if those are invested in the technologies and activities of the future of the 21st century, they're going to be more likely to stand you in good stead if your retirement is 30, 40 years down the road. So you can ask about your pension and where your money goes. So there are lots you can do. You can press your politicians, and that, of course, your voice and your vote are very important in bringing change to bear. It also, and you know, as a university teacher, you see your students, at least in decent times, choosing where they go to work. and they want to go to work for a company in which they can be proud and which does it goes about its task in a responsible, environmentally friendly way. A good friend of Mary and myself, is Paul Polman, who has just finished 10 years leading Unilever, and leading it very well, and actually making it a very much more valuable firm in terms of conventional measures. But at the same time, and actually that they were mutually supportive, making it a still more responsible firm from the point of view of the environment and the supply chains. They get something like 2 million job applications a year. That if you get the best people, you're going to do well. They attract patient capital and patient investors. Consumers do worry about the origins of what they buy. So it's good for your customer. And we've seen right through firms that are being more responsible, being firms that are doing better on conventional profitability measures. That's actually been true through this last few months as well. So where you work and who you buy from is a very important part of what individuals can do, of course, along with their voice and their vote and what they demand in terms of systems change. So there's a tremendous amount that people can do. We shouldn't see ourselves, and Caroline Lucas of all people doesn't see herself as passive in any sense. You can get out there and change, and full of affirmation to the work that Caroline does.
So, Mary, I don't know if you want to have a go at this as well. And I can't speak for or to Caroline because she's not on. We're not face to face, but there is a more radical sense that our planet's on fire, our planet's burning. We've got to really change radically our lifestyle. Sort of caught most obviously by Greta Thunberg. What do you say to?
And I noticed that. Yeah, I noticed that she mentioned the possibility of a universal basic income, which I think more people are thinking about. As it happens, Nick, I've just come off a web call with the B team of business leaders that Paul Pullman is the chair of. And there was a really interesting discussion about the fact that those who are made unemployed tend to be at the lower level in companies, far disproportionately. And they're the ones that suffer more, that companies need to think about the equity of those that they furlough or lay off at this time. All kinds of interesting, Sharon Burrow was talking not just about patient capital, but patient debt. That debt itself has to become more patient in that sense. And I think we need a lot of innovative thinking at the moment as to how we are going to come out. I mean, the truth is that the most devastating impact of COVID-19 is going to be in developing countries. And they're already suffering later and increasingly the health dimensions of it. But lockdown for somebody in the informal sector, if you don't work, you don't have food. And therefore it's so much more difficult. For a girl out of school in the developing world, it may well mean early child marriage. Because that's the alternative. And, we have to be aware of just how serious the situation is. It's sad that the G20 is not stepping up as much as it should. The elders very much support Gordon Brown in urging the G20 to really take a global COVID-19 response, including debt relief significantly for developing countries and much more support as time goes on with this patient debt in the future.
Could I amplify that, Shaun? Because it's absolutely critical. And Mary and I have both been signing the letters to the G20, as well as weak healthcare systems and weak social security systems. Developing countries have faced the biggest fall in remittances since records began. And remittances are bigger than foreign direct investment. They've suffered from capital flight, they've suffered from falling commodity prices. Many have suffered from collapse, particularly from the collapse in tourism. This has been devastating for developing countries. This is a world economic crisis in a way that 2008-10 was not. 2008-10 was rich country financial systems getting into deep trouble through their own negligence and recklessness. But that had very big knock-on effects around the world. This is much bigger than that. The effects themselves are taking place around the world and hitting developing countries for all those reasons, particularly severely. So the debt position is genuinely untenable, unsustainable. And if debt is unsustainable, it won't get paid. And disorderly collapses do damage to everybody. So the position of world debt in this last 6 months or so has become really extremely difficult. And we saw, as it were, immediate, we did see action in the G20 and the World Bank IMF meetings in the spring, in April, but that was standstill for particularly the group of poor countries, when, of course, that does matter and it is a good place to start, but it needs much more than a standstill. It needs write-downs, and it needs to extend way beyond the countries that we see at the moment. And, you know, Mary, you know, the kind of impact it had, you know, 80% of the children in the world roughly are out of school at the moment. We understand that at the moment, but will they get back? And that depends in large measure on public resources. So this is the kind of challenge that we face. It really is immense.
Thanks. So, Belinda, I think we've got time for one quick question and answer, and then I'll ask the panelists to sum up.
I'm not sure it's a quick one, but there have been quite a few questions about transport, which it feels like there's a real moment of jeopardy in terms of transport. There's huge opportunity for sort of a change of trajectory, but in the UK at least, there's been a recorded huge increase in car use over the last couple of weeks. What do the panelists think can be done to get transport to be greener in future in light of the health concerns?
I think that the making cities, towns much more friendly to cyclists and pedestrians. In the UK, we probably have to make our mind that electric scooters are okay, and that we have to make their use easier. So those are things that we know we're going to have to do over the longer run, but actually we can get on with very quickly. I think we're going to have to accept that for a year or so, there'll be a sharply diminished enthusiasm for using public transport. But that isn't a story about public transport over the indefinite future. So we have to handle this next year. And I do think that, you know, cyclists, pedestrians, electric bikes and so on will be very important. But plan for the future, which goes beyond this period when people are turning away from public transport.
Thanks, Nick. Mary?
I can only add a small point that apparently bicycles are the rage in Ireland, and bicycle shops are making huge profits at the moment. So I'm pleased to hear that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask just each of you a concluding question. Mary, you've spoken about the vacuum of international leadership coming from the White House, and you've also mentioned Gordon Brown's call on debt relief. The UK is hosting the G7 next year, co-hosting COP26. What should the UK's priorities be for those conferences?
I think the fact that the UK has the presidency of the COP and the chair of the G7 is an immense both challenge and responsibility, and it was one that the UK wanted to have. So, you know, now it is important to step up with ambition, to recognize that we have to get out of COVID-19 in a rescue way initially. That's true, but we have to do our rescue as much as possible in full alignment with addressing the climate crisis. And we have to prepare now for the COP, which will be towards the end of next year now, November next year, because it's going to take more both planning and, you know, to actually work our way forward to make sure that every country is making the commitment to be net zero, that every corporation, that every business, every city, every town, every community. I mean, we need countries to think now in terms of all of government, and all of community together on this. And that isn't really happening. There's a little bit of a vacuum in diplomacy on preparing for that conference next year, which is so important. And I think people are more alert to climate. The opinion polls show it's more something they want to have addressed. And I think the UK has to give a great leadership at a time where I know also, because my country is affected, there's Brexit to deal with in this period as well. And that's quite a heavy lift towards, over the summer, I think. But really, there is a need for that leadership, and the EU will clearly be a leader partner with the UK on this.
So the UK needs to step up and do more, essentially, to prioritise COP26.
Very much so, yes, and be more vocal on it, yes.
Great, thank you. And to Nick, if I can give a version of a question that Pilota Clark from the FT asked, what would you regard as the single most important policy or measure the government can introduce to ensure a low carbon recovery? And if I could also ask, what is the thing that they should stop doing? Is it the subsidising fossil fuels, the roads programme, or so one positive thing and one thing the UK government should stop doing?
I think it's very important, if you allow me, two things that well, let me start with what we should do. We should recognise that a sustainable recovery, bringing forward those things which we know we have to do to a period of unemployment, is likely to be the most powerful form of recovery. I tried to articulate those at the beginning, but we've got deep unemployment, probably 10% or so at the end of the year. I doubt if it will come down that fast, and we have to take strong action. So I think the sustainable agenda is a very powerful one. So there's a tremendous amount that we could do to encourage retrofitting of buildings, to extend broadband, to work on making our cities more attractive to cyclists and pedestrians. Those are three examples which we can get on with very quickly, which the government could encourage. A lot of it actually could be done by the private sector with the right kind of incentives. I think in order to make that kind of thing happen, we need a national investment bank. We've lost access to the European Investment Bank. So to build back in this way, I think we need to have a national investment bank, and we have to have a much more active British business bank. So those are the priorities in terms of activities and how those activities could be financed. With that, I would suggest, as we've discussed, having a priority as we unwind loans, as we convert loans to equity for the net zero targets and activities, so that we encourage and partner firms to support the jobs of the 21st century. And actually you find, and Mary referred to the B team, you do find firms that regard that quite rightly as reasonable and helpful. It's not it's not aggression, it's partnership in moving in a good direction. So I gave examples of a set of activities, gave examples of how we can work to finance those activities. And if one last one is the following: do not try to close the deficit, do not try to close the debt to GDP ratio too fast. Give yourself 10 years, not 5 years, because if you try to do it too fast, you'll plunge the economy back into, or keep the economy unemployed, and that would be the most dangerous outcome of all. Dangerous for the social fabric, dangerous for our politics, and dangerous for our environment.
Great, thank you very much. That is the end now. The event's been recorded. It'll be on YouTube, Green Alliance's YouTube channel, probably tomorrow. We will produce it as a podcast as well, so I hope you'll look at that. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I'd like to particularly thank Ollie Mount and the team at Green Alliance, Belinda, for putting on the event. But at this stage, normally we would have a round of applause for Mary Robinson and Lord Stern. I think you have to Imagine a standing ovation right now. So thanks very much indeed for that. And also at this stage, normally at a Green Alliance event, we'd be herding you into a separate room to give you fine wine and canapes, and you will have to imagine those also.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks particularly to Mary and Nick, and I hope we'll see you at a future Green Alliance event.
Great to be with you, Nick, as well.
Thank
And
you.
thank you to Green Alliance. Great.
Thank you. Lovely to see you, Mary and Shaun. Bye-bye.
Yeah.